Hello friends, it's great to be back in front of all of you once more, and I hope you're doing great as far as your preparation is going on. As I said, keep visualizing, keep enjoying the process while you're putting in that hard work, and that is what is going to yield you the results. The session today is going to focus on a very important aspect of the finance section, which is your descriptive writing, and I am actually going to take you through another demo. Obviously, what I would recommend is watch the previous demo that I've already conducted so that you get good sense of the way I approach things. The only difference in today's session is that I'm actually going to be writing while I keep talking to you. So because I'm writing, I'm also going to be able to convey to you what exactly was my thought process when I was writing something. Why did I incorporate something in the answer? What benefit does it bring to the answer? What is the thought process of a reader when he's reading your answer? And how can you maximize your output? Those are the kind of things that I'm going to be discussing. I'm also going to be looking at some important models that can basically help you turn out the best result for you as far as descriptive writing is concerned. The reason this session is quite long is because while I'm writing, I'm also talking to you guys and conveying the thought process, and that's the reason why the overall length of the session is long. Having said that, it's very important that you go through it because it will give you a good mindset of a writer, and looking at me writing, you can also incorporate similar kind of qualities in yourself, and looking at my thought process, you can develop your own thought process for writing as well. So that was the intent of this particular session. So I hope you enjoy it. A word of caution or disclaimer, there are a lot of models that are being discussed on various channels right now. It's important that you understand any model that you pick, find out whether you're comfortable using that model, and comfortability does not necessarily mean using that model, but it also means to be able to apply that model in a short duration of time and using that model before the exam. If you do not feel that comfortability in that model, I would suggest do not look at any model at this point. Stick to what works for you. Stick to what is your comfort zone, because there isn't too much time for you to tweak things around at this stage. Having said that, there are definitely a lot of complicated models also being discussed in the market right now. For example, mind maps, a fantastic tool provided you use it the right way, right? Mind maps, let me give you a use case. For example, if you want to, let's say, have a very important discussion with the CEO, right? And you're looking at various points or angles to basically convince your CEO for something, then using a mind map, applying it and bringing all possible thoughts, brainstorming, and that is what a mind map will really help you, because it will help you clear your thoughts, have a structured approach towards that particular argument and help you win that argument. But it will also take time. Right? It will take time for you to prepare that mind map to be holistically able to convey what you're trying to say and then get the outcome that you're looking for. Right? So be very, very mindful that in a time-bound exam like this, wherein let's say only a few minutes are available at your disposal to basically clear your thoughts, clear your mind, and pen down your answers, or should I say type down your answers. At this stage, using a complicated model like that, which obviously requires good amount of expertise, and also might not be exactly relevant for usage as a time-bound exam. So those become very, very important criteria to decide whether you want to choose such a model or not, right? Having said that, there are definitely better ways than just jotting down your points, but at the same time, you don't need to go to the complicated level of mind maps also. So what I'm going to be discussing through this demo is also some of those techniques which can probably quickly tell you what exactly can you write and how exactly can you structure your points, segregate your points, and get the best out of your writing, right? That is what we're going to discuss today. So without further ado, let's jump right in. So before we get into the nitty-gritties of the topic of discussion today, what I want to quickly do is revisit some of the models that I have discussed in one of my previous videos, and that can obviously be found in the description to this particular video, right? So what it will do is that it will help you understand the models that I'm discussing today in a lot better manner, right? So the first model that I'm basically discussing is what is basically your IBC. It's a fairly straightforward model, and it basically talks about three fundamental pillars of any kind of writing that you do, which is your introduction, body, and your conclusion, right? So when I talk about the introduction, a very, very important aspect overall, because this is the one that helps you capture the attention of the reader. Now the point is, how do I capture the attention of a reader? Is it the same phenomenon everywhere? No, right? The reader's attention depends on who my reader is. If my reader is basically someone who's reading a newspaper, then the attention grabbing technique there is very different from a reader who is with me to read a novel, right? So the perspective changes, the expectation of the reader changes, and because the expectation of the reader is different, I cannot use the same technique to attract the attention of my reader. In this case, who's my reader? My reader in this case is obviously the examiner who's trying to see if I possess good enough sound knowledge about the subject. Do I have a good understanding of the concepts, right? And next, do I have a strong structure? Is my mind thinking in a structured way? Do I have clarity in my thoughts? So these are the things that I'm trying to test as a reader. Now, how do I grab the attention of a reader of this type, right? So the first thing that I look to do in this scenario is, of course, the fact that I will basically look at various ways in which I can capture the attention, right? So one of the ways is basically trying to be quirky, right? You can start off with a saying or a quote, or write something which resembles like a newspaper headline, right? But it's not exactly a newspaper headline, but resembles one. Those are some of the ways in which you can kind of hook on the reader. Next, the other aspect that you can look at is maybe you can start with a question, right? And the question doesn't have to be a factual question all the time, right? It can also be something called as a rhetorical question. Now, what do I mean by a rhetorical question? Rhetorical question in the sense that, for example, there are questions that generally don't have very clear answers, right? For example, I say, how many drops of sweat are required to succeed in the RBI Grade B exam? Now, is there a clear answer to that? Obviously no, right? So the thing is, it kind of makes you ponder that when I pose a question like how many drops of sweat are required, it makes you think that, oh, RBI Grade B is not such an easy exam. It's an exam which requires me to put in a lot of effort. That's why we're talking about drops of sweat, right? So it's a rhetorical question, which means it does not have an answer, but what it does is it does make me think. That is the most important aspect. So these are some of the ways in which you can make your introduction a bit catchy and attractive as well. Now, the other important aspect to understand is, why do I need to capture the attention? Because as soon as I get to capture the attention, the reader is hooked on. If the reader is hooked on, what does it mean? It is generating the interest of the reader. So if I have generated the reader's interest, and if basically I do a good job in terms of the body of the essay or the topic that I'm writing, then automatically what am I doing? I'm definitely improving my chances of getting a higher score. And that's exactly the thought that needs to be there when it comes to the introduction, right? Now, before we come to the body, I wanted to discuss the conclusion. So on similar lines, the conclusion needs to be again as powerful as the introduction, so as to have the same kind of an impact. Next thing that I want you to remember is, ideally, look at your introduction and see if you can try and ensure that your conclusion is on similar lines. So let's say you started off with a positive thought, ensure that you end on a positive thought. If you started off on a negative thought, ensure that you end on a negative thought, right? So all those become a little important. And the other aspect that I want you to remember is, let's say, for example, I started off with a question as the introduction, then the conclusion should ideally carry the answer. Or let's say if I start off with a question, then the conclusion could also be another question. So those are the ways in which you can end and kind of complete what you started in the introduction, because conclusion at the end of the day is basically a completion. What is it doing? It is culminating my article or my essay, right? And more importantly, it is giving the essay a finality. And that is the reason why this again needs to be very, very powerful. That's the context, right? Again, if I can ensure that my conclusion is unique, what does it do? It basically generates greater amount of interest in my essay, and again that greater amount of interest, and if I've culminated it well, then basically can again result in a higher score. That's the context, right? Now coming to the next aspect, which is basically your body, right? So here we had discussed a lot of models in the previous session. So what I would want you to do is look at that previous session video, and you can basically look at some of the models that we discussed. Obviously we talked about something called as your timelines, then we discussed something called as your pro-con approach, and then we discussed another model which is basically your doctor and symptoms approach, right? These are some of the models that we had discussed in the previous session. would be good that if you can look at it so that you get some idea as to how you can approach and how you can look at leveraging those elements as well, right? Now, a body is fundamentally working on some very critical principles, right? So when I talk about the body, what are the critical things that I am looking to ensure? So it obviously needs to be highly crisp, right? Why? Because there is obviously a word limit. And what does verbosity do to my word limit? Verbosity means what? You're writing more words than what are required for a particular type or particular concept. If you end up writing more words, automatically what is happening? Your return on investment in terms of words is actually quite pathetic, right? So if your return on investment is pathetic, whatever number of words you write, it's going to have lesser impact. That is where you need to ensure that your body is absolutely crisp. That's the most important aspect. Next thing that I'm looking at is basically ensuring a very strong structure as far as the body is concerned. So when I say structure, these are some of the elements that can definitely help you achieve that aspect, right? Next, I'm trying to ensure that I improve the readability for my reader, right? And this is where it brings the concept of clarity as well. So how do I bring in that clarity? One of the ways of bringing in clarity is through the transitions. How can I bring in the transitions? By ensuring that one para deals with one or at the max two thoughts and nothing beyond that, right? So one or 2 points at maximum is being covered in a para, and then with the transition to a new thought comes a new paragraph. The other way I can improve the readability is by looking at, let's say, what is called as your subheadings, right? Now, it doesn't mean that you give a heading or a subheading to every single paragraph. That doesn't make sense, right? But whenever there is a major change in thought, right, at that juncture, there should definitely be a subheading put in place. Now, again, think of it from the perspective of the reader as well, right? So when you look at the overall piece that you've written, the reader will be able to spot, let's say, 6 or 7 subheadings and automatically understands that this person has a very clear thought process and this person has a very clear structure in his or her mind, and that is how this person has actually thought about the subheadings, and that is why the clarity is there, right? So clarity and readability again becomes a very, very important aspect. And last but not the least, the most important thing that you need to concentrate is definitely the content itself, right? Now, how do I generate content? Now, one of the tips that I can suggest to you here is that mind maps as a technique is definitely something which is good, but it has its own limitations, right? So what are the limitations of mind maps? Mind maps should ideally be used when you have time at your disposal, right? When you are an expert in understanding the usage of mind maps, right? And when you are confident of being able to apply it effectively, right? Now, these are the fundamental times when your mind maps can be effective. They can be a very powerful tool, of course, but they need your mind to be at ease, right? If your mind is under any kind of a pressure, then this method might not succeed at all, right? And it obviously requires a lot of time for you to master this technique. So ideally, I would not recommend a mind map to be used in a time-bound exam, because obviously it takes time for you to first master mind maps, secondly become an expert in it, and obviously even when you're trying to draw a mind map, it will take its own sweet time. So it will not be that straightforward or that simple, right? But is there a method which can still work instead of just jotting down points, right? Because jotting down points again does not give you clarity in terms of what you're writing where, right? So in that context, the model that I recommend to you is this. What it can help you is that it can help you segregate your thoughts into multiple buckets, right? And it also allows you to pick and choose which bucket do you find relevant and when do you want to use it. Now, what does steel pegs stand for? So your S stands for social, your T stands for technology, your first E stands for economic, the next E stands for your ethical angles, then your L stands for your legal, then your P stands for your political, Then your next E stands for your environment, right? Next one stands for your global angles about something, and the last S stands for society. Now, what's the fundamental difference between the first, social, and the next one, which is society? So when I talk about society, I'm essentially talking about inclusion, right? Ensuring that there is no discrimination or everything is working seamlessly. And on the other side, when I talk about social, social is referring to the mindset and the thought process of people, right? What exactly are the ideas, and let's say if I am thinking about something, will there be any negative perceptions towards it? Those kind of elements get covered in the social side of things, right? And tech obviously is related to technology, economic obviously related to anything from a monetary standpoint, all of those elements covered there. Ethical, obviously the question of integrity, honesty getting covered from that perspective. Then when you talk about legal, anything to do with the justice system or anything which is, let's say, against regulations, so all of those elements, right? You talk about your circulars and all those elements from a master direction perspective, regulatory perspective, all of that gets covered under legal. Political obviously talks about the political environment and the situation either in the country or, let's say, within the state or whatever that you're talking about. The environment obviously refers to, let's say, sustainability, how it is impacting the environment, climate change, and a lot of other related elements. And when I talk about global, it's not just from an India standpoint, but what is the overall take from a global perspective. Those elements get covered in the global angle, right? So when I say steel pegs, one of the biggest advantages that you get over there is that it basically allows you to generate points. Unlike a mind map, wherein I will still have to think in order to come up with my ideas. But when I look at steel pegs, it basically allows me to kind of look at a topic and it automatically gives me how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 avenues to start thinking, right? Which means that even if I'm not too comfortable with that particular topic, I may still be able to generate at least 4 to 5 good points, right? And it doesn't take too much time for me to spend and jot down points from a steel peg perspective. So instead of basically jotting down random points, I'll be segregating those points very clearly into segments and then jotting down those points. And it makes my clarity element also quite strong because I'm very clear as to the transition. So for example, I start off with social, then move into the legal elements, then move into the global aspects, and I can basically transition quite beautifully within my points, right? The other thing which a steel pegs allows you to do is it also allows you to put a very clear filter in terms of usage, right? So depending on how many points you're able to generate, you can filter out the points which you feel may not add that much value to your content, right? So those points can be automatically filtered out, right? And only those points will be retained in my answer, which I feel will make my answer firstly unique, and second, they will give enough value in terms of numbers, right? That is the context. And obviously the most critical element there is that obviously I need to have the enough amount of knowledge about that particular point if I'm including that point in my answer, right? So these are some of the things that you can look at doing, right? So definitely a much easier method to apply and master in a short duration of time. And it also gives you enough opportunity to generate points. Even when you're not comfortable with a particular topic, how do you generate points and come up with an answer? That is where your steel pegs can definitely help you, right? Once you've applied steel pegs, then you can decide as to which model that you want to use, and you can automatically use one of the models that I had described earlier, which is either timelines or pro-cons or your doctor symptoms kind of an approach, and each one of them can actually reap you great dividends, right? So that is what I want to discuss about the overall structure. So one, obviously, just to quick recap, we're looking at the introduction, body, and conclusion, and then within the body, how do we ensure that we get the best out of the content that is available, and how do we write it in the best manner possible. Another important aspect that you need to focus on is have at least 1 to 2 minutes left at the end so that you can proofread your answers, right? Now, if you go and ask any editor, when does the best output come? Or if you go and ask any writer, they will tell you that the best output came out after multiple rounds of editing, which means you also need to proofread your answer. you also need to get to a situation wherein you've at least cross-checked your answer for different types of errors, which could be some words being missing somewhere, grammatical errors, some error in the thought itself, and also to see if there is a proper transition happening from one paragraph to the next. So that is where proofreading becomes very, very important. So you have to spend at least a minute or 2 minutes quickly running through your answer so that you ensure that all possible errors are eliminated, right? So having understood this, let's quickly get to the topic of discussion for today. So let me take you through the answer that I've already written first, and then I will basically share the portion where I've actually written the answer, right? So firstly, what I've tried to do is again apply fundamental elements of, let's say, introduction, body and conclusion, and then I looked at the timeline method, and some bit of structure was already given in the question when they asked about the models and regulations. So that's the approach that I've kind of used. I've basically combined timeline, then I've kind of brought in regulations, and I've also brought in the model. So how exactly is the essay shaping up? So you're looking at, let's say, a definition of microfinance, a good introduction. Then I look at it from a background perspective, talk about what was the situation in 1990s, then what happened in 2005, what happened in the next 5 years, and then what is the subsequent decade. So when I talk about the subsequent decade, I automatically bring in the regulations, and then talk about some of the key regulatory changes that have kind of had an impact on this particular sector. Obviously, you can limit to this, let's say, maybe 1 or 2 points, or maybe increase the number of points. It's entirely your call. But again, I've given some points so that you can pick and choose the ones that you would want to highlight. Then again, you move on to what was the impact of those regulations. Again, you have to culminate that particular aspect. What was the benefit of bringing in those regulations? And then you talk about a transition and move into the successful model. So the last line, basically, if you read, it says, which has also been reflected in the kind of models that have been proven successful. And then I bring on the successful models and discuss, let's say, 2 to 3 models that have been there in the system. Again, I've given you multiple models. You can pick and choose the ones that you want to use, or you can bring on your own models as well. And then I bring into a very important aspect of any answer that you write, which is the interlinkage between, let's say, your static topic versus the current affairs. Right. So this is where you need to bring in some knowledge about that particular topic. Right. So what I have suggested is ensure that you pick up each and every topic that is there in the syllabus and at least have 3 to 4 data points at your disposal. That will really help you in framing your answers and use those data points wherever required. Right. So again, in this particular answer, I've kind of used certain points that are kind of highlighting the importance overall. Right. And then I also bring in the latest context in terms of the TLTRO as well. So these are certain things that I've again added. And then I culminate it with the conclusion, which again kind of syncs it beautifully with the introduction that I had used initially, right? So it's important that you sync your introduction and conclusion so that it becomes easier for the reader to kind of interpret where exactly you're going, and it kind of shows the clarity of your thought as well, right? Another important aspect which I wanted to convey before I close is that overall the session obviously appears to be quite long, right? Because while I'm writing, I'm also talking to you guys. So I'm telling you my thought process as to why I'm writing something. So that is the reason why the session itself is quite long. But when you start writing on your own, obviously you will not be speaking. So as a result, the overall time duration will be significantly reduced. Second point, if you look at the overall length of the answer, it is definitely much longer than what the word limit could possibly be. But the reason I've written a long answer is because I'm giving you multiple options to pick and choose how you want to write or frame your answer, right? That is the thought process with which you should definitely work at, right? And this obviously has been written with the thought that this is probably a 15-mark question, right? So keep these points in mind before you look at the actual way that I've written the answer. So let's now look at the question of discussion today, right? So you have this particular topic in front of you, right? And it basically says that describe the state of microfinance institutions in India and shed some light around some of the models and regulations in this space. So that is what the topic starts with. So again, if I go back to the basic model that is discussed so far, I'm going to look at certain basic elements. I'm looking at the introduction, then I'm looking at a good body and a conclusion. And the other aspect that I'm going to try and work out is how do I link the introduction and the conclusion. And the model that I have in my mind is, because it is talking about the state of MFIs in India, I'll probably try and adopt a timeline approach. And then I'll basically link it with some of the elements that have already been asked. So it's already talking about models, and then it's already talking about regulations. So I'll basically put them in between as well, so as to ensure that it kind of gives a good structure to the article. Now, when I look at starting off with my answer, the first thing that I'm looking at is a strong introduction and a slightly different introduction. So I was thinking what I can do. So I say, because I'm talking about microfinance, let's start off by saying that M for microfinance, right? And it's also sometimes called as your micro credit. And let's start off by looking at a proper definition itself, because it's obviously an answer which needs some kind of an understanding, and I need to prove to my reader that I know this topic. So I say provides. What does it do? It provides your small credit to the low income groups or individuals, right, who otherwise would not have access to formal. Again, the critical element is that they won't have access to formal financial services, right? Obviously, the informal loan sharks and let's say your zamindars are still there, right? So they don't have access to formal financial services, right? With another very critical aspect, that there is no collateral involved whatsoever, right? So this is what I look at starting with. So I basically say that M for microfinance, microcredit basically provides small credit to your low income groups or individuals who otherwise would not have access to formal financial services with no collateral whatsoever. Now I need to obviously bring out the purpose of this part, right? So then I basically say that so it is actually M for Messiah. Now I don't have to explain this because Messiah is automatically indicating that you are actually a God sent or a savior for the people, right? That's the context with which I started. So it's obviously slightly different in terms of the normal introductions that the reader would have come across. It's slightly different, and in that context it gives me the ability to grab the attention of the reader, right? Now when I look at quickly framing the other aspect, which is the conclusion, then obviously what I'll try and say is that since I started off on a positive note as far as your passage was concerned, I'll basically start looking at an ending also with positive note, right? So let me start off by looking at culminating some of the things that I may think of. I'll probably say that with limitless benefits, which benefits are we talking about? So I'm talking about, let's say, including, what are the benefits? Basically talk about things like self-sufficiency, because you're giving income generating options for the people. We're talking about stability, again a very important angle overall, right? And if you want to give emphasis to these, what you can do is maybe capitalize them and it gives more emphasis to that particular word, right? Then you talk about obviously a very critical aspect, which is your women entrepreneurship, right? Again a very crucial angle. Then we basically look at financial literacy, again a massively important angle that basically come in, right? Then you're also looking at a very critical aspect, which is digitization of information as well, right? And one of the most important things that gets forgotten many times is basically the aspect of a crisis support, right? Maybe met with an accident, maybe a sudden situation crops up in the family and I need funding for that, and this is where these kind of institutions can bring in that much value. So then I say that is how your MFIs are basically the key to what? Obviously we're talking about financial inclusion, right? So they are the key to financial inclusion. And where are they a key? They are a key to financial inclusion in a country of a billion hopes and dreams, right? So this is, if you read these two together, it kind of forms a sync between what was written in the introduction and the conclusion, kind of culminating and bringing both the elements together beautifully, right? That is what I was looking for, the introduction and then the culmination and the interlinkage between those two, right? That is very, very important. Now that I've basically kind of framed the introduction and the conclusion, I kind of know that whatever I write in between has to be majority supportive, right, of MFIs in India. And maybe if I have some negative points, I may just probably mention those negative points, but not delve too much into those negative points. But predominantly, I've decided that my essay is going to be majorly positive, right? That's the thought with which I'm looking at this particular answer. So now, what I'm going to do is I'm also going to give you a fairly detailed answer in that sense. And you can obviously pick and choose the portions that you feel are relevant overall. So this answer may not be sticking to the word limit, but what it will definitely do is that it will give you enough material, enough content to be able to generate your own answer from this, right? So what am I looking at next? So the first thing is obviously I want to give a bit of a context. So as I said, I'll be using the timeline approach. So I went into what is called as the background. So I write something like background. Another thing you want to be very careful is be aware of the character limit as well. So is the word limit there, or is there a character limit that is there? So if there is a character limit there, I need to be very, very careful even in incorporating things like a space or a colon and stuff like that, right? So if there is no character limit, I'm okay to put a colon and move to the next line, right? But if there is obviously a character limit in place, I would probably avoid this colon and then move to the next line. And then I kind of go into the background as to what is the kind of past as far as this particular model is concerned. So I go into details like, let's say, modern microfinance industry, right? Obviously, we're talking from an Indian context. Let's say started in the 1990s, right? And it was obviously inspired by one very famous person, right? And that person basically gave the Grameen model of MFIs, and this was basically Professor Muhammad Yunus, and this person belonged to Bangladesh, right? So the context is, again, I try and cut down unwanted words wherever possible. So instead of saying in Bangladesh, I basically just put a bracket so that I'm saving some characters there as well, right? Now, so this is the background. So India started in 1990s, inspired by the Grameen model of Professor Muhammad Yunus. Now there are certain things which it is okay or acceptable to have short form. So for example, a Professor Muhammad Yunus is fine. It's understandable that you're referring to a professor, but more specifically speaking, if you want to be very, very particular about it, you should definitely write the entire word itself, right? But what it does is that it obviously curtails my overall number of limits as well. So if it's a pure word limit, it's not a problem, but if it's a character limit, then I would prefer to stick to a prof instead of a professor, right? So it's your call at the end of the day, but be mindful of that is what I'm saying. Now, over time, this model, of course, has definitely evolved and also boosted the confidence, right, of obviously the customers who started trusting the system a bit more, your microfinance institutions themselves, and also the other stakeholders. And what it in turn did was thereby giving fillip or kind of encouraging the sector in terms of scaling up. That's exactly what this did. Now that's the basic background. Now when I look at the next stage of the timeline, I basically look at a period, let's say 2005 onwards. What did we see? We see that you had many non-profits in this space, right? And obviously these were your non-profit MFIs, so let's keep it that way. So non-profit MFIs converted into for-profit NBFCs, which means that they started generating revenues. That's the whole idea, right? And at the end of the day, how will you see if a particular sector is succeeding or not? When, let's say, even the non-profits are able to generate revenues, right? And many new for-profit entities also came into existence, right? So I say many new profit NBFCs also came in. So not only did the non-profit MFIs convert into for-profit NBFCs, many new for-profit NBFCs also came in, right? And they started attracting private capital. What else did they do? also definitely gave rise to greater amount of commercialization, right, in this space. It did give good amount of structure as well, and greater level of effectiveness, right? So this is what exactly happened during this period, right? Now what did this do? This obviously fueled the growth, right? It also gave rise to greater amount of competition, right? And also scale with a sharp focus that happened on, let's say, delivering microcredit, one, in an efficient manner, and at the same time generating profit as well. So profitably, one, efficiently, and second, profitably, right? So within a span of, let's say, 5 years, you saw that the industry in India scaled rapidly, right? But there were also certain challenges. So I say that this period also witnessed challenges, right? And what were these challenges around? Basically from a customer protection standpoint. Now why am I bringing this here? Because the next paragraph that I'm thinking about writing is about the regulatory environment and the RBI coming in with the NBFC MFI, which is where I need to transition it effectively, right? So which is where I'm basically looking at bringing in the challenges so that it lays the foundation for the next paragraph, which is going to be about regulation, right? So I talk about various elements in terms of customer protection, right? So let's say I say including what are the elements that you think can be the issues. Obviously there was over leverage, too many loans just being given randomly, right? Then also you talk about oversight, wherein not many things were carefully observed, or let's say regulatory angles were not properly considered, challenges were not probably looked at carefully. Another important aspect was, let's say, your inadequate disclosures, right? Again, very crucial. Then you're talking about lack of your customer awareness, because the customers did not know themselves as to what this product was all about. And at the same time, you're also talking about a lack of regulations, right? So it was a lack of customer awareness and regulations. Then you're also talking about a higher level of pricing. Then you're talking about, let's say, risks in terms of geographic concentration, wherein, let's say, the areas which had the ability to understand such products, obviously the concentration was more there, so there was lesser level of penetration as a result. So risk for geographical concentration and lesser penetration in that context, right? And there are also situations like your ghost loans, wherein people would take the loan and then just go away. Those kind of things were also happening, right? And there were many such local level barriers as well, right? Wherein you had interference from the local bodies also. So these were things that were definitely happening. Now the reason for mentioning this is because of what I want to do next. So this is the background that I've given from the India story perspective. Then I move to the next subheading, which is basically regulations. And I'm trying to show a picture as to how the situation in India changed, right? So I'll basically call it regulations, let's say, a game changer. Now we'll have to talk about regulations in this context, right? So in this case, what happens is you're talking about the RBI stepping in. So I talk about, let's say, recognizing this. RBI basically introduced a new category, right? And this was basically your NBFC MFIs, and this happened in your December 2011, right? Now what was the objective? With, let's say, specific regulations for the sector, right? Now if you see, when I talk about interlinkages, what was the basic problem that I highlighted in the previous paragraph? I said challenges around customer protection. So again I say focusing on customer protection, is what I'm trying to address. Okay. Now, I'm also saying that since then, the industry has obviously had a hugely successful period. Right? Now, this lays the foundation to address one of the important aspects of the question, which is what are the regulations in this space. Now, what I'll try and do is quickly try and summarize some of these regulations here. So, I quickly move on to the next para and I start saying that some of the key regulations are as follows, and I quickly step into them. So again, I would like to segregate my regulations also in such a way that it brings out greater clarity. So I say clear definition. So it calls for a clear definition, and the RBI has given a clear definition. It says an NBFC MFI is a non-deposit taking NBFC with minimum net owned funds of rupees 5 crore. Right? Now, obviously, I'm aware that this is except the northeast region where it is rupees 2 crore. Right? With, let's say, not less than 85% of the assets, right, as qualifying assets. While I'll not go into the nitty-gritties of what qualifying assets is, but I would definitely want the reader to know that I know this, right? So what I'll say is that qualifying assets, and let's say in the brackets I say specifying clearly the type and let's say the income level of the borrower and also the tenor of the loans, right? So all this is clearly defined in terms of what asset would be considered as a qualifying asset, right? So that is the first element, which is your clear definition. Then second, I'm basically talking about a higher capital adequacy ratio as well, right? So you talk about all your new NBFC MFIs shall obviously have to maintain a capital adequacy ratio, again consisting of tier 1 and tier 2 capital. Again, notice one thing, that I haven't used capital adequacy ratio fully because I would assume that the reader would understand this kind of abbreviation. But let's say if I'm creating my own abbreviations, which I'm not very sure that the reader will understand, in that case I will probably have to define that abbreviation and then use it subsequently, right? That is going to be important. So for example, things like RBI, things like CAR, I would definitely expect the reader to understand, because obviously it's basically the RBI official only. So as a result, I would not want to look at writing the full forms there because it saves me some words, right? That's the context, right? So consisting of tier 1, tier 2 capital, this shall not, or should I say this shan't be less than 15% of its aggregate RWAs. And then again I say that the total of tier 2 capital at any point in time shan't exceed 100% of tier 1. So this is something that I am mentioning in the context of your capital adequacy ratio as well. The next thing that I would want to also look at is, because since we talked about pricing as an issue, we are basically looking at talking about the defined credit pricing as well. So what do I say here? Obviously in this case, you know that your margin caps have been put in place and they obviously may not exceed 10% for your larger MFIs, right? So I need to obviously explain what larger MFIs are. So basically I'm talking about loan portfolios greater than 100 crore, and this value is, let's say, 12% for others with the maximum variance that is allowed in that context. So I'd say maximum variance permitted for individual loans between, let's say, the minimum and maximum interest rate. That variance cannot exceed 4%. So I've also talked about the requirement of a higher CAR. I've talked about a very clear definition of NBFC MFIs, and I've also talked about the defined credit pricing. So while you can obviously get more points incorporated, but I think from a regulatory standpoint, what the question is asking, these many points should obviously be good enough, right? Now, obviously, I need to look at it from a structural aspect as well. So what was the impact of these regulations, right? So also, while I'm talking about the timelines, I'm also looking at the things that have been done and what is the outcome of those things. So similarly, I'm trying to adopt the doctor symptom model again. So here what I'm doing is giving a context of what exactly happened because of these regulations. So as a result, your microcredit in India, right, is one of the most tightly regulated sectors, right, in the world, right? And when I talk about it from the context of an example, I'll basically say, why is it tightly regulated? When you talk about the NPAs here, the NPAs are basically under 1% despite whatever external shocks that you're talking about. So this is again kind of a proof telling you as to why it is one of the most highly regulated, because the NPAs have definitely proved that it is one of the best performing markets, and also it is one of the largest globally, right, as a microfinance market. And then how is it globally largest? In the context that it is unmatched with respect to the outreach in terms of the reach of this overall sector, in terms of the low ticket loans that are on offer, right, in terms of the scale, in terms of the diversity of the supply side with so many players, NBFC, MFIs, NGOs, self-help groups, so many players basically coming in from this perspective, right? Then you talk about the spread, again bringing in the angle of efficiency, right, because the loans are getting paid back on time. Also talking about performance, and we talk about the customer protection standards, right? So from that perspective, it kind of culminates the paragraph that I started on your regulations, right? Then I basically look to move further ahead, and I need to talk about some of the models as well, right? So how do I make that transition, right? So I talk about and consumer protection standards. Then you basically say that which has also been reflected in the kind of models that have proven successful. So this provides a transition to the next, and I get into what is basically your successful models again. So I'm going to give you at least 3 to 4 models, and you can again pick and choose the model which you feel is relevant. You don't need to probably mention all the 4 models and write details about them. You can probably cut it short and, let's say, just give the names and maybe 1 or 2 lines about each of them. That should be good enough, right? But I'm anyway going to give the aspects fully for you. since I've already made the transition in the previous paragraph, I don't need to elaborate more again. So I can directly get into the successful model. So let's say, for example, I start off with the association model, sometimes also known as your group model. So I get into that, right? And I rightly say that, let's say 10 to 20 members of a target group form an association. Now this association could be again based on, let's say, gender, or it could be religion or political lineage, or you can also look at, let's say, cultural orientation. So there could be various elements that could decide the formation of the group, right? And then you're talking about the group making regular savings of, let's say, fixed amounts in a common fund, right? Then after, let's say, successful working of the group for few months, it is linked to a financial institution. Now in this case, while I would want to use financial institutions in the future in this answer itself, that's why I'm defining your financial institution as FI, so that if I use it later in the passage subsequently, it should not create confusion for my reader, because I've clearly defined that a financial institution is an FI, and FI does not stand for financial inclusion in this case. And for emphasis, I have kind of let financial inclusion be financial inclusion itself, and I have not cut it down into an abbreviation, right? So next I say the FI then lends credit to the association, right? Now the group is basically responsible for the repayment, right? Now this model, what is the advantage? This model takes advantage of your social pressures, right? Your peer ties that are there, interactions with people, and basically also looks at group monitoring, right? So as to ensure that there is a repayment of the loans. So that's the context as far as the first model is concerned. And now obviously, how is it proven to be successful? I say that in India, an example for this model would be the self-help group bank linkage program, also referred to as your SHG BLP, right? So this program is obviously a prominent credit delivery model from an India perspective, and that is something which I am using as an example, and I clearly state that here, right? Then I look at the next model, which I would want to obviously talk about the Grameen banking model, because I have highlighted that in the beginning of my writing. Master stroke by Professor Muhammad Yunus. This model works on the concept of joint liability. It also kind of promotes credit as a human right and assumes that the skills of the poor are underutilized. Then I say a center is basically formed in this with limited people, and the loan is sanctioned to a few people in the center. So that's in a nutshell about the Grameen Bank model. The next interesting model that you can basically look at is your ROSCA or the chit fund model. So what does this one talk about? It basically is saving in a rotating manner. So when I say rotating savings and credit association, that's what is a ROSCA, and it's similar to a chit fund as well. It basically allows simultaneous savings and borrowings. A group of members make a regular fixed cyclic contribution to a common fund. In this case, at the end of the cycle, the total fund collected goes to any one member, right? Just like your kitty parties, again, that's the same context here as well. So it kind of fills the gap that has been left by your traditional banks, or should I say traditional banking system, right? It definitely looks to provide easy accessibility and flexibility as well, right? So that is the context as far as this particular model is concerned. The last one that I wanted to discuss was basically your individual banking model. So what happens in this case, looking at your MFI, basically sanctions your loans to an individual based on, let's say, his or her creditworthiness, and assists in skill development and outreach initiatives as well. That's how more and more people can be reached, right? Now, cooperatives, RRBs, usually adopt this model for giving loans to your farming and also the non-farm unorganized sector. As a model, it kind of suits your product driven small businesses. Now, if you look at an example of this, it will basically be your SEWA, which is your Self-Employment Women's Association in India. Right. So I don't want to get into the expansion of this right now. We've kind of addressed most of the elements as far as this question is concerned, but we need to close the timeline as well, right? So that is where we get into what is called as your current standing. So I talk about the fact that today the micro credit sector has, let's say, 180 plus regulated microfinance entities, and you have, if you look at the number, it's quite staggering when you say that you have over 5 crore plus borrowers. Then you have over 10.5 crore plus active loan accounts, and a burgeoning, or something that is constantly growing, industry loan portfolio, right, of over 2.32 lakh crores. That's a massive number again, which again has a significant weightage in terms of the rural segment and also a sizable portion coming from the urban segment as well. In terms of reach, it is basically covering over 600 districts in the country. So when I bring data into my answer, what it does is that kind of brings in huge amount of credibility to my answer. So from a finance perspective, what is it that you can do is that you have a very restricted syllabus, right? So you know the topics very well. At least have, let's say, 4 to 5 data points in your fingertips as far as each topic is concerned, right? If you have the latest data points, what it does is that it will allow you to do what I'm doing in this particular paragraph. Because I'm bringing in this current standing angle, what I'm doing so beautifully is basically bringing in the interlinkages. I'm able to link a static topic, right, and linking it beautifully with the current affairs, right? That is what is required. So basically what you should look at doing is very simple, that each topic that is there in your syllabus, at least try and see if you can gather 4 to 5 data points so that you can quote those numbers wherever it is relevant, right? Now get back to the answer. To add the latest bit of information here, addressing the stress caused by the pandemic, the RBI launched TLTRO 2.0 of rupees 50,000 crore, out of which 10% was to be apportioned in securities / instruments issued by the MFIs, thereby helping them out. So a clear regulatory framework, sound underlying business models, sectoral performance standards, right, in terms of how it has performed overall, and a massive untapped potential has attracted private capital to sustain the growth and further bring in technology, right? So this is the culmination that I'm looking at, and then I finish off with the last sequence, which is the conclusion itself. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed today's session. So just to quickly summarize, you're looking at your introduction, your body, and your conclusion. Introduction and conclusion, try and sync them in the right way possible, and there are different ways in which you can frame an introduction and conclusion which can be really catchy and powerful. And when you're talking about the body, look at the different models that I've discussed in the session today, and also look at ways you can generate content within that. Keep very clear thought in your mind in terms of the crispness of what you're writing, in terms of the structure of what you're writing, in terms of the clarity of your thought, the transitions that you need to take. All of those things become very important. And also remember the interlinkages that I talked about. How do I link a static topic with the current affairs part of it, right? So look at the syllabus, pick out, let's say, 4 to 5 data points from each topic point within the syllabus, and that can give you good points to basically mention within your essay or within your answer itself. So that will give you some strength in terms of interlinkages as well. And as I said, keep reading as much as possible, because only reading can make you better at writing. And having said that, it's not just about reading, you have to keep writing also continuously. Keep practicing answering questions every single day over the next 7 days, and ensure that you get the best outcome for yourself, because unless you write now, you will not be able to write on the day of the exam, right? So that is something which is very, very crucial for you to implement. So keep in mind whatever things I've discussed today. It's going to definitely help you write a lot better on the D-Day. So on that note, this is Ravi signing off. Have a great day and a wonderful, wonderful week ahead. And I see you in the next session.